So for this third example, I actually decided to record the notes that I already have up here. So the original problem was given by y equals 3 sine of 2x minus pi over 3. Notice how complicated it is, right? There's a number in the front, there's a number in front of x, and there's this funky looking thing right here, right? We know that if we add or subtract some number in a function, we know it's going to shift it either to the left or to the right. And so this is going to tell us how much to shift. Okay, so how do we start this? We start by figuring out what the amplitude is, the period, and the phase shift. So the amplitude is this number here, is that 3. So we write it down. The period, again, you're using the formula 2 pi over b. b is the number in front of x. So we bring that down. These twos cancel, and I get pi. Okay, so now they've got period. I know that one cycle of a curve is going to be pi. It's going to be pi part. The phase shift tells us where we actually start. So instead of actually starting here at 0, we're going to start somewhere else. I'm going to show you where I got these numbers in a second. But to get the phase shift, you use this formula, negative c over the absolute value of b. C is already negative pi over 3, so we write that down. So pi over 3. And notice that I made it positive because you've got a negative, you got a negative, that gives you a positive, okay? Then we divide it by b, which is 2. So pi over 3 over 2 is the same as multiplying by the reciprocals. It's pi over 3 times a half, or pi over 6. So that means that the beginning of the cycle is going to start at pi over 6 instead of at 0. So it's going to make finding the other values a little bit more harder. How do we figure out where it starts? Well, this is what gives us where we start. So we already have this point. So we can go ahead and write this point down, pi over 6. Okay, we know the period is pi. So we know between pi over 6 and our endpoint, it has to be pi apart. And so if I take pi over 6 and I add the period, which is pi, notice I can write this as the LCD, the least common denominator, is 6. So it's pi plus 6 pi over 6 is the same as pi. I get 7 pi over 6, so I know that my ending point is going to be 7 pi over 6. So that leaves me the job of figuring out what this point is, what this point is, and what this point is. Okay, so how do I figure that out? Remember, how we figure it out is we have to take the period and divide it by 4. So my first point here, okay, pi over 6 would be my first point. My second point, which I call here the first point because that's the point that I'm trying to find, is we take the period, we divide it by 4 to figure out what we need to add to this first point to get to the second point. So I have here 1/4, so pi over 4, I'm going to add it to pi over 6. Again, the least common denominator is 12. I get 2 plus 3, which is 5 pi over 12. That's going to be my second point. To get from this point to this point, I'm going to have to add pi over 4 again. That's what I did to get that point. So I get 5 pi over 12 plus pi over 4. So 5/12 plus 1/4 is the same as 8/12 or 2/3. And I just add the pi at the end. So that's going to be my middle point. And notice how I put the middle point right there. And finally, to get this next point, I have to take 2 pi over 3, that middle point that we found, add another pi over 4, so it's like the same as adding 2/3 plus 1/4, and I get 11/12 over pi, which is right here. And then just to verify that this is correct, I took the 11 pi over 12, I added pi over 4, and sure enough, I did end up getting my last point, 7 pi over 6. Okay, so then at this point, what do you do? Okay, well, you know that it's a sine curve. We know we have to go all the way up to 3. We know we're going to have to start at the bottom at the x-axis. So we're going to go up to 3, where the 5 pi over 12 is. Then we're going to go through 2 pi over 3, all the way down to negative 3, where the 11 pi over 12 is, and then go all the way back up to 7 pi over 6. Notice again that our curve doesn't start here. It's shifted over. Okay, so a lot of the problems that you're going to have to do, at least these more complicated ones, you have to find these three things: the amplitude, the period, the phase shift. You have to remember that if you want to figure out what the points are, you have to start with the period, divide it by 4 to figure out how much you need to add to get to the next point. What you really need, you need 5 points on the x-axis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and then you have to remember how the sine and cosine graph look like in order to connect the dots. So remember, you need a max, a min, and 3 x-intercepts. So if you need to pause the video, go back and rewatch some of the steps again, I encourage you to do so. Hopefully this helped you understand how to graph sine and cosine curves a little bit better.